Can you force someone to stay in a relationship that's already over? In a world that sees divorce as a last resort, Christianity offers a very different view. Marriage is not a contract to cancel, but a bond not easily broken. But what happens when that bond becomes a burden? When staying together becomes impossible? And when the marriage ends in reality, yet still exists on paper? Is this ban truly absolute? Or are there exceptions where separation is allowed? Here the story begins. A faith that sees marriage as sacred and a reality full of unbearable cases. Does banning divorce really protect the family? Or does it create deeper crises? Why do churches differ? And how did marriage become a sacrament no one can leave? That is what we will try to understand in one of the most controversial issues. For more details, stay with us until the end. And do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you get every update. In the early centuries of Christianity, the Church was not the authority controlling marriage and divorce, nor was it a binding legal reference in such matters. Early Christians lived within the Roman state and followed its civil laws like other citizens. At that time, marriage was not a church sacrament as we know it today. It was a civil contract made under Roman law. The Church's role was mostly spiritual, blessing the union, guiding the couple, and offering moral teachings. But it did not impose laws or intervene in the legal details of marriage or divorce. Even religious texts were first offered not as enforceable laws, but as spiritual principles to be lived by according to one's faith and ability. There was a kind of balance. The state managed civil life, and the Church cared for spiritual life. But that did not last long. The major shift began in the 4th century CE with a pivotal event that changed everything. Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity, and it then became a recognized religion in the state. Christianity was no longer a minority faith. It became a fast-spreading religion joined by thousands with different levels of belief. Here the problem appeared. Many new converts did not share the same spiritual depth or the same earlier view of marriage. Cases of unstable marriages, family problems, and a shallow view of marriage began to appear. At that moment, the Church could no longer remain only a spiritual guide, because reality had changed and society itself needed clearer order. So the Church began to step in gradually, though not suddenly or fully. At first, its intervention was limited and often optional. It set rules, but those who followed them did so by choice. As time passed and the Church's role in society grew, that intervention began to expand. Principles turned into laws and guidance into regulation. Marriage became not just a civil contract, but a relationship with a clear religious dimension, subject to the Church's conditions and managed within it. With this shift, the idea of divorce also began to take a different shape. It was no longer just a civil procedure, but a matter touching the bond's sacredness. So banning divorce was not a sudden decision, nor a rigid rule from the start. It was the result of a long historical development in which Christianity moved from a faith living within society to an institution that organized society and set its laws. In the earliest beginnings, marriage was not viewed as it is today. It was simply a contract between a man and a woman, made according to prevailing customs and laws. The Church then gave it a spiritual blessing. In other words, the Church did not create marriage, it only blessed it. The relationship itself already existed, with or without a priest. Over time, especially as the Church's role in society expanded, this concept began to change gradually. The Church no longer saw marriage as a civil bond it blessed, but as a bond with a far deeper meaning. It came to be seen as a spiritual union symbolizing the relationship between Christ and the Church. Here came the great shift, from a blessed contract to a church sacrament. With this shift, marriage outside the Church was no longer acceptable, because the sacrament, in Church thought, could only take place inside the Church and through a priest. From here came clear conditions. Marriage had to be in the Church, in a designated place, before a recognized priest, and according to specific rites. It was no longer just a formal step, but part of the doctrine itself. With this concept established, a direct and decisive result appeared. No marriage outside the Church. Any union made outside this framework, even if civilly legal, was no longer considered a valid marriage in the Church's view. In some cases, it was even seen as an illegitimate relationship. Here the full picture becomes clear. When marriage becomes a sacred sacrament, it is no longer just a bond between two people, but a religious tie not easily broken, because what is established as a sacrament is not undone as simply as contracts are. This is the real key to understanding why divorce in Christianity became so complex, because the issue is no longer ending a relationship, but dissolving a sacrament the Church sees as sacred. When speaking of divorce in Christianity, we cannot treat it as one fixed view, because the truth is that the position differs from one church to another. In the Catholic Church, marriage is considered a sacred sacrament that can hardly be broken. The principle is clear: marriage happens once and lasts for life. The Catholic Church does not recognize divorce as such. It speaks only of annulment, meaning the marriage was invalid from the start. So ending a marriage in this context is extremely difficult and subject to long, complex procedures. In the Orthodox Church, however, the position is somewhat different. While keeping the same idea of marriage's sacredness, divorce is not absolutely rejected, but it is allowed only in very limited cases, chiefly adultery, and sometimes for other reasons tied to breaking the core of the marital bond. Even then, divorce is not granted easily, but only after review, verification, and a church decision. Historically, this strictness was not always the same. In 1938, a regulation greatly expanded divorce grounds to include desertion, abuse, impossible cohabitation, and other life-based reasons. The aim then was to find practical solutions to people's problems, especially as social complexities grew and courts entered personal status matters. But over time, objections began to arise within the Church itself. One view held that this expansion, though it solved many problems, moved away from the traditional understanding of marriage as a sacred sacrament not to be ended easily. From here, a reverse trend began to appear, calling for a return to doctrinal roots and limiting divorce grounds as much as possible. This trend did not happen all at once, but gradually, until it reached its peak in the decisions of 2008, which fully redefined the issue. Divorce grounds were sharply reduced, returning almost to the strictest form: adultery and sometimes change of religion. So it can be said that orthodoxy stands in a middle position. It neither fully bans divorce nor allows it broadly. As for Protestant churches, the situation is more flexible. Marriage is understood less as an unbreakable sacrament and more as a covenant that may end in some cases. So some Protestant churches allow divorce in broader cases such as infidelity, impossible cohabitation, long abandonment, or physical or psychological abuse, or when the relationship has completely collapsed and can no longer be repaired. Here the real difference appears: the same religion, but different applications based on interpretation. This leads us to a very important question. Is marriage between different denominations, such as Orthodox and Catholic, allowed? In fact, this type of marriage is one of the most complex issues. In the Orthodox Church in particular, there is clear strictness on this point. The rule is that marriage be between two of the same faith, because in the Church's view, is not just a relationship between two people, but one that extends to faith, rights, and the upbringing of children. So the Church sees denominational difference as something that may later cause problems, especially in marriage and divorce laws and in practicing church sacraments, and in some cases. The Orthodox Church does not recognize a marriage performed outside it, even between Christians of other denominations. Here a clear paradox appears. The marriage may be legal and civil, yet not recognized by the Church. By contrast, some other churches are more flexible on this issue and therefore allow mixed marriage under certain conditions. But in general, the basic principle in many churches remains this: unity of faith is a condition for marital stability. So the differences between churches are not limited to divorce alone, but also extend to who is allowed to marry and whom they may marry. In the end, the answer may seem simple: divorce in Christianity is rejected. But the truth is more complex, because what we see is not just a law, but a much deeper idea. Marriage is not a passing relationship, but a covenant meant to endure. Yet between that covenant and a merciless reality, questions arise. Must a marriage continue whatever the cost? Is protecting the idea more important than saving the person? Between differing churches, changing laws, and unresolved cases, one truth remains clearest: the issue is no longer only about divorce, but about marriage itself. So is it an unbreakable bond no matter what? Or a relationship that may end under strict conditions? Here the video ends. Do not miss the chance to follow more by subscribing to the channel and turning on the bell so you receive every new update.